Part 2. Let's start painting. Step 5. Base coating with speed paints. What's nice about speed paints is it forms a solid base coat while also adding low and highlights to the figure. Alright, so I'm going to cover the entire figure following the color scheme from the game's artwork. Colossus is relatively simple. He's mostly silver, red, and yellow. Now you'll see I'm using black in areas where he has metal. Speed paint does have metals, but I like the look of my opaque metals more. So what I'll do is paint on black speed paint, and then the next step I'll dry brush opaque metal over top. So order of operations. The general rule I follow is under to over, then dark to light. I know a lot of painters will do light then dark, but I find it's less cleanup later on if I do dark then light. Because if I paint into the light areas, I can touch up with white first before I apply the light speed paints. And then under to over layers, I typically start with skin and under layers of clothing. If something's dark, light, under, over, always choose under first because you'll want to paint the hard to reach areas first. If you do those later, it's too easy to paint into other areas and it will create more work for you in cleanup. This tutorial I'm kind of going over how to speed paint and then highlight and layer after speed painting. But what you could do is, instead of the speed paint, you could be doing a base coat. Just keep that base coat, thin enough that it's not getting too thick, but thick enough that you're still getting, a good amount of coverage. You still want the figure to be almost opaque by the time you finish with the base coat. It just doesn't have to be fully opaque because you're going to be doing a lot of other stuff and layering on top and stuff to, fully flesh that figure out. Step 6, layering, detailing, and cleanup. This stage of painting will vary on your preference. You can spend a lot of time going over the figure to pull out details and enhance the highlights, or you can quickly go over the splotchy areas of speed paint to clean them up and be done. Because the speed paint is translucent, I like to go over the highlight areas of the figure to paint a better highlight because I don't like the look of the translucent highlight. When you are layering your paints on top of the speed paint, it's important to try to keep that paint thinner. Throughout the whole process of painting, you want to make sure you're not covering up too much of the detail of the miniature. The goal of painting is to help enhance those details and not to overpaint so that those deep recesses and details are starting to get covered up with too much paint. So I'll sometimes use the flat or long edge of the brush to carefully graze over the raised areas. And when I do this, I typically use a little bit more paint than I would for a true dry brush, but less than I'd use for layering. It's sort of like, I like to call it wet dry brushing. I don't know what the actual term is. And it just gives you a little bit sharper line when you graze over the raised areas than it would with like a true dry brush, which will leave a little bit of a grainy texture on the figure. So as I said, when I'm layering or doing my wet dry brushing, I try not to put too much paint on my brush. It's sort of a fine balance of getting enough coverage without it being so thick that you can almost see the layers of paint, starting to build up. When I was first starting to paint, I always painted way too many layers. Like I would spend a lot of time on my base coat, and then I would move on to doing a wash, and then I would do highlights on top. And what I found, with using the speed paints is your base coat doesn't have to be fully opaque. Like your base coat could be enough to get good coverage because when you start highlighting and adding detail, those translucent areas of the paint are going to get covered anyway with the highlights. So if you start covering it too thickly with paint in the base coat stage, by the time you're finished with the detailing, there's just way too much paint on the figure overall. The other thing I'll do is if an area looks a little splotchy or a little bit too translucent, I might just layer on more pigment of an opaque paint on top of the speed paint just to kind of clean up how it's looking and get rid of some of that splotchiness and make the color a little bit more even looking. Like for instance, the yellow on Colossus is almost transparent, so I'll spend some time layering on more yellows, and then I'll take a lighter yellow and paint around the edges of the raised areas to create a highlight effect. And then once I'm happy with the overall look of the figure, I'll start narrowing in on his face, painting his eyes, eyebrows, and mouth. I'll do the inside of his mouth first and then lightly lay on an off-white for the teeth. For teeth and eyes, I like to use a cool off-white. I have this one from Reaper called Ghost White, which I really like. It's like just a hint of blue in the white. You could also use like one that has more of a warm tone, like a bone color or something like that. For monsters, I'll use it for teeth and nails and stuff like that. But for heroic figures, I like the cool off-white instead. It just looks it looks a little nicer. So for the eyes, I'll paint the white first, and then I'll paint on a little dark brown or black for where the eyes go. And then once that dries, I'll kind of lightly paint on a pigment for the eye color, and then add a little pop of white for a highlight. And then I kind of just spend some time looking over the figure. If it's a hero figure or one that I'm going to play with often, I'll spend a little bit more time cleaning them up and pulling out some of the details so that they look a little bit nicer. If it's like an army or a horde of enemies, I won't get as picky. I'll kind of pick out some of the main details, usually around the face, hands, and stuff like that, like areas with finer details, pull those details out. But I'll leave a lot of the other paint a little bit loose. I won't get as picky about going over some of the highlights. Let some of the speed paint kind of be as is, as long as it's not too blatantly messy or something like that. Yeah, so that's about it.